There are crimes so brutal, so heartbreaking, that even hardened investigators struggle to describe them. Among the darkest chapters in New York City's history is the case of Elisa Izquierdo, a 6-year-old girl whose story became a national symbol of how a system meant to protect the innocent can fail in the most devastating way. For the officers who walked into the crime scene, it was one of the most violent cases they had ever seen. For the public, it was a tragedy that brought tears and anger in equal measure. And for the memory of Elisa, it was the end of a short life filled with both promise and unimaginable suffering. Elisa was born in 1989 in New York City. Her father, Gustavo Izquierdo, was a Cuban immigrant who adored his daughter. He cared for her with patience and tenderness. Elisa's early years were full of love, laughter, and the kind of safety every child deserves. But tragedy struck when Elisa's mother, Elisa Lopez, began to fight for custody. Elisa had a troubled history, drug addiction, instability, and a record of abusive behavior. Despite her background, she pursued custody through the courts, insisting she wanted to raise her daughter. At first, it seemed impossible that the courts would even consider granting custody to Elisa. Teachers, relatives, and child advocates spoke up for Gustavo, emphasizing the care and stability he provided. But in a decision that would haunt the city forever, the court awarded custody to Elisa in 1994. Gustavo was devastated, but he had no choice but to comply. Elisa was sent to live with her mother, and from that moment on, her life descended into a nightmare. The abuse began almost immediately. Neighbors, teachers, and relatives noticed changes in Elisa. The once bright, cheerful little girl became withdrawn, timid, and nervous. Bruises began to appear. She wore long sleeves even in warm weather. When asked about the marks, Elisa gave vague answers or looked to her mother in fear. Teachers reported their suspicions, but child welfare agencies failed to take effective action. Each warning was documented, but somehow Elisa was left in the hands of the very person hurting her. By 1995, the abuse had escalated to shocking levels. Elisa used brutal punishments on her daughter, locking her in dark rooms, forcing her to eat her own waste, and hitting her repeatedly. Elisa's cries were sometimes heard by neighbors, but when they called authorities, little was done. Some workers claimed there was not enough evidence. Others said the system was overburdened. Whatever the reason, Elisa remained trapped, suffering behind closed doors. Her school became the only place where Elisa felt some safety. Teachers cared for her, tried to protect her, and gave her moments of kindness. But even there, the signs of her abuse could not be hidden. Elisa sometimes begged not to go home. Once, she whispered to a teacher that she was afraid her mother would kill her. Those words would prove prophetic. The final night of Elisa's life came in November 1995. Elisa, consumed by rage and cruelty, beat her daughter mercilessly. The details of what happened are almost unbearable to hear. Elisa was struck repeatedly, thrown against walls, and left with massive head trauma. When emergency workers were finally called, it was too late. Elisa was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were far too severe. Doctors fought to save her, but she died shortly after arrival. The brutality of her wounds left seasoned professionals in shock, and one doctor said it was the worst case of child abuse he had ever seen. When police entered Elisa's apartment, they found evidence of prolonged torture. The conditions were filthy. Elisa's small belongings, dolls, clothes, little treasures of childhood, were scattered among the chaos. Investigators later admitted that even for officers accustomed to crime scenes, this one broke them. The violence inflicted on a defenseless 6-year-old child was beyond comprehension. News of Elisa's death spread quickly, and the city was outraged. The media covered the story extensively, highlighting the repeated failures of the system that should have protected her. Reports showed how teachers, neighbors, and even family members had tried to raise alarms, only to be ignored. How could a child so clearly in danger be left with her abuser until it was too late? That question became a rallying cry for reform. Elisa Lopez was arrested and charged with murder. In court, prosecutors laid out the horrific details of Elisa's final months. Witnesses testified about the abuse, Medical experts described the extent of her injuries. The jury listened in horror as the evidence painted Awilda as a woman consumed by cruelty, incapable of love, and willing to inflict suffering on her own daughter. The defense attempted to argue that Awilda was a victim of her own troubled past, but the jury saw only the monster who had destroyed a child's life. The verdict was guilty. Awilda was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, a sentence many felt was not enough for the brutality of her crimes. But for Elisa's family and for the public, justice could never feel complete. No prison sentence could undo the years of suffering or bring back the little girl whose life had been stolen. The impact of Elisa's case went far beyond the courtroom. Her death sparked immediate calls for change in New York's child welfare system. Politicians, activists, and citizens demanded reforms to ensure that warnings from teachers and neighbors would never again be ignored. In 1996, the city established the Elisa's Law, also known as the New York State Child Protective Services Reform Act. The law aimed to strengthen oversight, improve communication between agencies, and ensure that reports of abuse were taken seriously. Elisa's name became a symbol of reform, a reminder of the cost of failure, and a plea to protect children above all else. Yet even with reforms, the pain of Elisa's loss remains. For her teachers, who loved her like their own child, the guilt of not being able to save her never faded. For her father, Gustavo, the grief was unimaginable. He had fought to keep his daughter safe, but the system had stripped her away from him. He lived with the torment of knowing that, if Elisa had stayed with him, she would still be alive. His heartbreak became one of the most devastating parts of the story. What makes this case so unforgettable is not just the brutality of the abuse, but the innocence of Elisa herself. She was a little girl full of potential. She loved to draw. She loved to sing. She had a shy smile that lit up her face. Those who knew her described her as gentle, kind, and eager to please. Her life should have been filled with school, friends, and dreams for the future. Instead, it ended in tragedy at the hands of the person who should have protected her most. For many, the case of Elisa Izquierdo is a constant reminder of the responsibility adults have to protect children. It teaches us that ignoring warning signs can have devastating consequences. It shows that evil can exist in the form of neglect, silence, and bureaucracy as much as in direct violence. Because Elisa's death was not only the result of her mother's cruelty, it was also the result of a system that looked away too many times. Today, Elisa's name is often invoked in discussions of child protection laws. Her story is taught in schools of social work and law enforcement as an example of the importance of vigilance. But beyond the reforms and the laws, Elisa is remembered as a child who deserved so much more. Her memory lives on not only in tragedy, but also in the fight to save other children from the fate she suffered. When you hear the story of Elisa Izquierdo, it is impossible not to cry. The details are unbearable, the injustice is overwhelming, and the image of a small girl, trapped in a nightmare she could not escape, stays with you forever. The officers who worked the case said it was the most violent, heartbreaking crime they had ever seen. For everyone who hears it, it becomes a story that will never leave them. And that is why Elisa's story must continue to be told, not to shock, not to horrify, but to remember, to honor her life, and to make sure that no other child suffers the same fate. Because in the end, Elisa's short life changed an entire system. Her tragedy gave birth to reform, and her memory demands that we do better.